Hello and good afternoon. The state of British education is a source of growing concern to parents and politicians alike. There's a widespread feeling that many schools are failing both the children and the country. And it seems increasingly certain that education will loom as a major issue in the next election. Indeed, Sir Keith Joseph, the Education Secretary, is facing a motion of no confidence in Parliament on Thursday. Sir Keith is with us in the studio, and later in the programme we'll be talking to him about the government's plans to deal with what many people see as a crisis in British education. First, though, let's have the latest news headlines from ITN and Pamela Armstrong.
President Reagan's special envoy, Mr. Vernon Walters, is continuing his talks in European capitals seeking support for a possible American strike against Libya. He's now in Bonn. It's thought unlikely that Mrs. Thatcher would allow American jets based in Britain to attack Libya. Meanwhile, Libya has called on Arab countries to boycott America, including a halt in oil exports to the States. Detectives in Dublin have searched a big council estate in their hunt for the kidnapped banker's wife, Mrs. Jennifer Guinness. They were told she was being held captive there, but they found nothing. Prayers for Mrs. Guinness were said in both Protestant and Roman Catholic churches this morning. In India, militant Sikhs have called on an armed uprising against the government. They told a meeting at the Golden Temple in Amritsar that Sikhs had been deprived of their rights. An armed police siege at a house near Rotherham in South Yorkshire has ended peacefully after 17 hours. A man who'd been holding a girl hostage in the house surrendered to police. And now, back to Brian Walden.
Ever since his appointment as Education Secretary in 1981, Sir Keith Joseph has felt that the British school system is in need of major reform. Though committed to comprehensive education, he's been forthright about what he sees as the shortcomings of the system. In Sir Keith's view, it fails to stretch the most able children. And as many as 40% at the lower end of the ability range get little benefit from their schooling at all. So he's seen it as his overall aim to raise standards in the state school system. First of all, he's wanted to raise standards by reforming the curriculum, that is, the content of education, and the exams. The curriculum on which children are currently tested in the GCSE and CSE exams is widely thought to be just too academic for a large percentage of them. It's not sufficiently related to their everyday lives or the sort of work they can expect to do. Nor does it give these children enough of a chance to use other kinds of abilities they may have. What's more, the less able are likely to be quite unnerved by the thought of an exam on which the verdict on their entire school career overwhelmingly depends. So they tend to write themselves off in advance as failures, get increasingly bored and just give up trying. At the same time, marks in examinations aren't given on the basis of absolute standards. Instead, it's determined that a certain percentage of children who sit the exam in any year will get A's. Another percentage will get B's, and so on. This means, in effect, that the brightest children need only to do better than the average in their particular year in order to shine. So at both ends of the ability range, children do less well than they might. But after several years of work, Sir Keith and his advisors believe they've come up with the answer. It consists of a new system of examination leading to the General Certificate of Secondary Education with a new style curriculum. The new style curriculum is designed to make school subjects more accessible to 14 to 16-year-olds by making them more relevant to their own experience and way of thinking. The curriculum also contains more practical work. This is meant to give academically less able children more of a chance to feel that what they are good at is valued. It should also equip them better for jobs they might do. The GCSE system has widespread support amongst teachers and parents, and Sir Keith has been planning to introduce it in the coming school year. But it's not the only measure which he's wanted to take in order to raise standards. He's also thought it necessary to improve the quality of teaching in the schools. In Sir Keith's view, though the majority of teachers do a good job, a proportion of them don't. They may be poorly trained, insufficiently motivated, or lacking the necessary talent. There's also a shortage of good specialist teachers in subjects like maths and physics. This is because, under the current pay structure, it's not possible to offer the extra incentives that would be needed to attract them into teaching. Sir Keith has wanted to tackle these problems first by more training for teachers both before and during their career. He also wants to introduce a system of regular assessment of teachers' performance. And he wants to add a new pay structure where differentials depend on the importance of the subjects people teach and on their performance. The teachers are in agreement with Sir Keith over the desirability of more training and regular assessment, but they object to the idea that teachers doing the same job should be paid differently according to their performance or according to the supposed importance of the subject they teach. And this has bedeviled the negotiations on the whole assessment system. But progress on both teacher assessment and the introduction of the new examinations and curriculum are now threatened by Sir Keith's political problems. One of them has arisen over the issue of spending on education. Though spending on education has risen somewhat under the Tories, many teachers and parents still regard it as hopelessly inadequate. Teacher morale has suffered as a result. But the effect has been compounded by the long drawn-out dispute between the teachers and Sir Keith over pay and the bitterness it's engendered. In particular, Sir Keith didn't just argue that the government's anti-inflationary strategy wouldn't allow him to increase his pay offer. He also made a number of statements that made teachers feel that in his view they didn't deserve more. The dispute left the teachers suspicious of Sir Keith's proposed pay structure as a means of restricting the next pay rise to a minority. But worse, they're adamant that they don't want his GCSE system introduced next September. The teachers say that the amount of money the government is proposing to spend on the introduction of the new system is less than a fifth of what's needed. More important, because of the dispute, nothing like enough preparatory work has been done on the new curriculum and the assessment procedures. The annual conference of the National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers earlier this month resolved not to cooperate with the introduction of the GCSE system next September. And the conference of the National Union of Teachers voted to continue teaching the old curriculum. It's not just the teachers, however, who believe that it would be best not to bring in the new system next September. 2 of the 5 regional bodies meant to run the new exams are also in favour of postponement. And the National Confederation of Parent Teachers Associations last weekend endorsed these calls for not bringing in the GCSE system in the autumn. Sir Keith, however, insists that the introduction of GCSE must go ahead as planned. But as time goes on, he will have to make a fine political judgment. It is possible that if the teachers refuse to teach the new curriculum or work the assessment procedures, then they will be blamed by the parents for the damage done to children's education. But it's just as possible that parents will blame the government for forcing the pace on GCSE. Indeed, it seems that Conservative MPs are already becoming worried about reaction amongst their constituents. 2 of them, Malcolm Thornton and Robert Key, last Tuesday voiced their doubts in Parliament about the wisdom of introducing the GCSE if current circumstances continue. But there's also a more fundamental reason why Sir Keith will have to tread carefully on this question. For the teachers' dispute has helped to turn education into a prime political issue. Opinion polls show that it's second only to unemployment amongst matters which people think that the government has mishandled. Aware that education could be a major vote loser in the next election, Mrs. Thatcher's government has resorted to a wide-ranging review of its educational policies. And the possibility that major reforms could be introduced has brought forth some radical ideas from various quarters in the Tory party. On the one side are people who believe that the problems of the education system could best be tackled through what might be termed free market solutions. Among the ideas favoured by the free marketeers, the introduction of so-called education vouchers has been prominent. The idea is to change the present situation, where parents only have the choice of sending their children to the local school funded by the state or to a private school where they pay the fees. Instead, the state would give parents vouchers for their children's education, which they could spend at any school they liked. The hope is that since parents would only want to send their children to good schools, bad schools would have to improve their standards for fear of being starved of cash. In other words, parents themselves would force up standards by exercising their rights and their children's rights as consumers of education. Sir Keith himself was a believer in the vouchers idea when he became Education Secretary in 1981. But then his civil servants convinced him that if parents kept moving their children in search of the best schools, this would make it impossible to maintain a stable school system offering an acceptable level of education to all children. Sir Keith himself told Parliament in 1984 that the idea of vouchers was no longer on the agenda because of the practical difficulties. In Sir Keith's education bill, now going through Parliament, there is provision for more places for parents on school governing boards, but no greater concession in their rights as consumers. But a powerful group of Tories continue to favour the idea of education vouchers, as has become clear in recent weeks. They're thought to include Robert Dunn, a junior Minister of Education, and Rhodes Boyson, tipped as a possible future Education Secretary, as well as Norman Tebbit and Mrs. Thatcher herself. And this has set people wondering whether vouchers are back on the agenda after all. But the idea of educational vouchers isn't the only one that free marketeers within the Tory party have been pushing. Another is a plan for schools funded from government grants, the size of which would depend on the number of children they manage to attract. The advantages of this, as the free marketeers see it, would be the same as those of a voucher system. Schools could only survive by attracting enough children, and this would keep them and their teachers on their toes. The idea of these schools is one of a set of radical proposals put forward in a recent pamphlet by 13 right-wing Tory MPs. But Tory reform ideas on education have not been limited to free market solutions. Some leading Conservatives seem to put their faith in the diametrically opposite route. They want more state intervention in what is, at the moment, a system based on largely autonomous local education authorities. Chris Patten, who is Minister of State for Education, is Sir Keith's number 2, seems to hold this view. In a speech last weekend, he gave a strong hint that if the problems of the education system are not sorted out soon, central government may have to take on a much stronger guiding role. Of course, Sir Keith himself has taken some measures that have a centralist flavour. For instance, the syllabus set by each of the 5 regional bodies that will run the GCSE exams will have to conform to criteria approved by Sir Keith Joseph himself. This is in place of the present system in which examination boards are free to make their own decisions on the syllabus. Sir Keith has also breached the principle that local education authorities can spend the grants they get from Whitehall as they see fit. A fraction, at least, of the money now has to go on purposes specified by the central government. But the centralist ideas being canvassed go a good bit further. One of these ideas would entail large-scale earmarking of government grants for specific purposes. If this happened, it would obviously have a major effect on the freedom of local education authorities to set their own policies. And this would be certain to provoke a political storm. But another of the main centralist ideas being canvassed is in its own way at least as significant. This idea would lead to the establishment of what have been termed Crown schools, which would be run not by local education authorities, but by the Department of Education and Science itself. These schools would be funded directly from Whitehall and get special support and close supervision. And their aim wouldn't just be to offer superior education to the children who attend them. They'd also be meant to help raise standards generally in the areas where they've been set up by acting as an example to the rest of the schools there. But as they'd mean bypassing the local education authority, they could also expect to encounter political opposition. Well, the main effect of this rush of new ideas has been to create increasing uncertainty about the direction of conservative education policies for the future. And unless the uncertainty is cleared up, it could become a political problem in itself for the Tories, compounding the difficulties caused by their handling of education. Sir Keith Joseph is the man best placed to offer guidance on how the Tories see their problems in the areas of education and their options for the future. We'll be back to talk to him in a moment.
At Barclays, we understand what you go through when you go looking for a house. The exhausting search. The constant tension. And always the fear that somewhere along the way, something might go wrong. That's why at Barclays, we try our best to make sure that you're never kept hanging around for a mortgage. However much you need, any Barclays branch will give you a straightforward answer very quickly. Because we know the answer could mean the difference between losing the house you want or getting it.
You're sitting on air, sitting in TWA's 747 Ambassador class because of the space, the comfort, the widest business class seats. You feel as though you're floating. Your head's beautifully rested, your back's comfortably supported, you're tilted gently as you recline. There's a rest for your feet and service to complete it perfectly.
Leading the way to the USA, TWA.
You know what good bacon has written all over it.
Lion's blackcurrant and apple sundaes, baked with pride.
When you're running a business, you often find yourself having to cope with the unexpected. British Telecom have brought out a new comprehensive directory just for business people. It's called Business Pages. It's got a specially designed classification and index system, which makes it much easier to use than any other general business directory. So whatever the problem, you can sort it out with a minimum of fuss. Business Pages, the only directory for the modern business.
Sir Keith, nobody would object to your efforts to raise educational standards. And many people would give you credit for what you have tried to do in general on education. But there's no getting away from the fact that it has become a very, very hot chestnut indeed now, and could very easily lose the Conservative Party votes at the next election. So I wonder if I may ask you about how you think this situation's arisen. Let's start with the teachers' dispute. Do you regard yourself as being quite blameless in this dispute?
How can I? There must be some better way to achieve objects. After all, until about 2.5 years ago, there was an abundance of people seeking to be teachers. People, I was told, of the right quality. People who wanted to be teachers at the then rate of pay. The moment it became clear that the abundance was shrinking, the moment anecdotes began to be told that good teachers were leaving the classroom, and the moment it became clear that the long-standing shortage of maths teachers, for instance, and physics teachers was getting worse, the government changed its attitude and began to offer extra money for teachers' pay in order to be able to recruit and retain and motivate people of the right quality. But some of the teacher unions wouldn't even enter into negotiations on the government's condition, namely that in return for extra money, there should be a transformed pay structure, making careers in teaching much more rewarding for effective classroom teachers, and a definition of teachers' duties. I'm glad to say that at long last some negotiations are now going on, but they were delayed for a very long time, during which some teacher unions, I believe very wrongly, took it out of the children, disrupted education. So perhaps I could have phrased the recognition that the moment the abundance of teacher applicants fell to an adequacy, the moment good teachers started leaving the classroom, the government was willing to pay more, because the government's policy in connection with public pay is to pay enough in order to recruit, retain, and motivate people of the right quality, and that applies to teachers.
All right, why didn't you handle it in that way? Why weren't you more acute to the problems that would inevitably arise with the course that you took?
But it's 2 years ago that I started saying that the government would be willing to pay more, almost as soon as the change in the number of candidates coming forward emerged. What I think I have to blame myself for is that I articulated all too clearly my dissatisfaction with the degree to which children of all abilities, from the highest ability to below average, were being stretched. And I think, although I was always careful to say that the fault could not be attached only to teachers, most of whom were very good. And because although I always said that much of the fault was due to discouraging homes, there's a minority of discouraging homes, and to an unsuitable curriculum, and to an unsuitable examination system, the teachers thought I was blaming them exclusively, and I wasn't.
No, but they were bound to think that to some extent you were blaming them, because to some extent you were, weren't you?
As part of the cause, yes. But there again, I would say that if you ask teachers to teach an academic syllabus to children who are not suited to an academic syllabus, I'm making no moral judgment whatsoever. The teachers are being given a very unsuitable task, and therefore I wanted to change the curriculum, to introduce applications of knowledge as well as acquisitions of knowledge for all levels of ability. And although I set out to change the examination system and to introduce better teacher training, more teacher training, the fact is that I was blamed by teachers, I think.
All right, so to some extent, I don't want to exaggerate it, but to some extent, you think that failures in presentation, possibly failures in imagination on your part, may have led, at least in part, to the alienation that teachers now claim to feel?
I would not accept, however, that teachers would have been right to draw that conclusion.
But you do accept that you might, in fact, have led them towards it somewhat.
How odd it is that I was the first person, at least I think I was the first minister, to focus on the fact that be it 35% or be it 40% of school children rushed to leave school at the earliest possible legal opportunity with no visible benefit in behavior, in preparation for adult life or work, let alone in classroom achievement from 11 years of compulsory education. Nobody contradicted me.
Sure, but that's a different point. To some extent, you accept some blame for the alienation that has grown between you and the teachers.
It would be too smug to do otherwise.
Splendid. Then let me take you on to something else. Let's now come to the question, another great political problem for the government, of course, because lots and lots of people have got hold of, from your point of view, the wrong end of the stick, what they think the right end of the stick, namely resources, the amount of money you spend on it. Now, lots and lots of people in the country in general, and I'm told in the recent Forum by-election, say Sir Keith Joseph hasn't fought for the money in Cabinet. He sat there as a Treasury dummy. He hasn't secured enough money for education, and that's why we're in this mess. Now, what do you say to that? Did you fight hard enough in Cabinet for the money?
The spending on education is more in real terms per child than ever before.
Not enough to satisfy them, though, is it?
But that's for another factor that doesn't emerge very often. That some, indeed many, local education authorities waste some of the money that is given them by taxpayers and ratepayers. And Her Majesty's Inspectorate, quite rightly criticising the shortage of books in some areas.
Yep. And the state of the schools.
And the state of the schools.
Because you're spending much less money on the capital side, aren't you?
We are spending less in order to reduce the danger of more unemployment through more public spending, yes. But let me just finish what I was saying. Her Majesty's inspectors, as well as criticising some shortage of books and some backlog in maintenance, the state of the schools, go on to say that in very many of those cases, it is not due to lack of money. It is due to bad management of the money by the local education authorities. And precisely the same report, as focuses on the shortage of books, goes on in another part of the same report to say, in many, many cases, this could be remedied by better management of their money by the local education authorities.
So what you're saying is that there isn't a shortage of money in education, and you've secured education, a very reasonable budget indeed. The blame lies with the local education authorities, many of whom are quite hopeless at, in fact, allocating it.
That is not the whole picture. Because...
Well, it was so far, wasn't it? What do you want to add to that statement?
I want to add to that, that in our attempt to get some constraint on the overspenders among local education authorities, and there are some very large overspenders who don't get much results from the overspending, if any, but they overspend hugely, we have had to put a straitjacket on local authority spending. And that has penalised those local education authorities that are very thrifty and careful with their money. So they are having to cut some things that in educational terms should not be cut. Now, the problem here has been that we haven't had a system till now, till this very year, under which we could give more to those authorities that would use it well without giving more to those authorities that were overspending anyway and were not using it well.
OK, that I follow, of course. Let me be quite clear that I fully understand what it is you're telling me on this. You're saying it isn't true. But I sat in the Cabinet and said, well, I could do with a lot more on education. But I most firmly believe in the Prime Minister's and the Chancellor's policy of forcing down inflation, so I won't ask for my fair cut, which my civil servants would like me to do. You are guiltless. You didn't do anything of the sort. You fought for and got as much as you could. But that anything that has subsequently gone wrong is either because the country simply doesn't have the resources to fund education as some people would wish it to, or because LEAs haven't done their job properly, and that you are blameless. Is that what you're telling me?
Blameless? Yes. But your interpretation is wrong to this extent, that if we had had before now a means to distribute education money so that it would help those who were using it well, without giving extra money that they would waste to those who would use it badly, we would have been able to do better. Now, that system has only just become available to us.
We will come to that later, by the way, because that's an important point. Let me move on to something else where you are currently the subject of great criticism, and it's not simply a matter of detail, it's quite fundamental to your strategy in a way. And that, of course, is the General Certificate of Secondary Education, the GCSE, as we say, using these horrible initials, the new exam. Now, practically everybody I talk to seems to think that you're quite right to want this. But of course, the teaching unions have said he may be quite right to want it, but in the first place, he hasn't given enough resources, in fact, to bring it about properly. And in the second place, due to the various disputes, there's been a lack of preparation, etc., and we cannot possibly do it by September. Now, you see the political danger in this, don't you? You may drift into the balmy situation where children are being taught for an examination that they won't take, namely the old curriculum, and they won't be taught for the examination they actually will take, and the parents will get very ratty about this, and they'll all troop out at the next election and punish the Tories for it. So can I ask you, is there no possibility of your compromising your view that this new examination has got to start in September?
No.
There's no possibility?
No, because the request for postponement, well, let me start earlier. You say that some of the teacher unions are urging me to postpone, urging the government to postpone. But in the immortal words of somebody from the recent past, they would, wouldn't they? After all, it's a very useful weapon for them to seize in their struggle to get more money from the taxpayer. So they would. But
Can
whether...
I just ask you on that point and then let you expand any other? Okay, then. You're a politician. You're a great thinker, too. Everybody acknowledges that, even your enemies. But you're a politician. Why don't you call their bluff? Why don't you say, OK, then you can have another year. Then you've cut their legs off, haven't you? If they come back at the end of that time and say, oh, we can't do it now, you can say, there you are, you see. I was right, wasn't I? These people are stalling. They're just out to get some more dough out of all this. Why don't you outsmart them politically?
Because my concern is with the children. And I don't believe for a moment that to postpone the exam for a year would necessarily mean that the teacher unions turn round and urge their members to prepare for it. One just can't be sure about it.
Then the children could be harmed, you see. Supposing they don't. Supposing they take this disagreement with you right down to the wire, and they don't, in fact, prepare their children. You will have harmed the children, won't you? Maybe unwittingly, but you'll have done it.
I am sure that some teachers will follow the advice of the unions that are advising no cooperation with the preparations for the new exam. I'm sure that some will. I'm equally sure that many teachers will put the interests of their pupils first and will, in fact, prepare for it. And they can prepare. After all, the draft syllabuses were in the schools last autumn. The approved syllabuses will be in the schools exactly to the program, that is in May. The criteria by which teachers will teach have been out for some time, and what the new exam requires is only good practice that many teachers already use. So I have no doubt that with the extra money the government has provided, and I announced an extra resources of £20 million for books and equipment only a couple of weeks ago, and with the extra training days that the government has allowed, 2 days in the summer term, and with the extra money for a repetition of courses which some teachers have missed, teachers who wish will be able to prepare. And I think that many teachers will prepare. Now, a new exam is bound to get off to something of a limping start. This time, the new exam has had preparations far, far, far beyond what there were for previous introductions of new exams. And I repeat that to defer, to postpone the exam would only be would only be to defer the risks now taken. There might be disruption then.
All right, but this very morning, Don McAvoy, the Deputy General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, has made a sort of offer. He said if you put more resources in still, and presumably that would be a matter of negotiation, they are prepared to negotiate about preparing the children for this particular examination. Now, let me put this to you as a politician. If there's one charge, rightly or wrongly, I make no judgment on that, if there's one charge made by your opponents most frequently against this government, it's insensitivity, bullheadedness. Now, don't you think that if in response to McAvoy you say, no, sorry, that's it, you've got to go ahead. The decent teachers will prepare their kids. The others won't, and parents will therefore have to take potluck, whether they've got a decent teacher or not. Whether you're right or wrong intellectually, you're going to cost your party a pile of votes.
I don't know about the offer that you quote, but I do know this, that despite the urging of some teacher unions, many teachers, subject leaders, have been on the courses that have been run for them, and there is, it's understood that teachers' unions, some of them, will seek every weapon they can with which to negotiate extra money from the taxpayer. Now, negotiations of a sort are going on under ACAS now about the conditional offer of extra money for teachers' pay, and I wish those negotiations every success. The National Union of Teachers, from which Mr. McAvoy speaks, has an ambiguous position in these negotiations. It won't subscribe to them fully, and yet it wants to be in there for the talk. And whether they're involved in the negotiations fully or not, I don't know. I only hope the negotiations succeed.
But just think about it, Sir Keith. Yeah. Just think about it. This chap, by the way, made the offer this morning on TVAM. Doubtless you'll want to look at it and all that. But what I want to get from you is some sense that you might conceivably budge for your own self-interest. Let me make 2 points. Firstly, you can't guarantee that every teacher will play fair. So some children are going to be unnecessarily disadvantaged, and some parents will be very angry about that. Second, the world being what it is. Since some people don't do very well in examinations anyway, every kid who does badly, the parents will say that it was because the teachers didn't prepare him properly, and the teachers didn't prepare him properly because they weren't given enough time, because you were too bullheaded and you wouldn't put it back another year. Now, hang on. Is a year that vital? Why lose 500,000 votes for the sake of bringing in an examination which hasn't existed before anyway, and which conceivably the world would not end if we waited another year to get it?
What a loss to politics you are, Brian. But on the substance, Mr. McAvoy has a certain embarrassment because the National Union of Teachers Conference passed a resolution against the wish of their executive that teachers of that union would prepare children for an examination that won't even exist in 1988. And that's a pretty absurd position.
It's the one they've got there, isn't it?
Mr. McAvoy is rather struggling to shift the emphasis somewhere else, and he's trying to put it on me. And I'm not going to negotiate, obviously, over this program. So I shall study what Mr. McAvoy has said and consider it, of course, carefully.
But as you stand at the moment, you want that examination introduced in September?
Yes, because I do not think that there is any guarantee that if it were deferred, it would come in impeccably at the deferred date.
All right. Now, let's come to a lot of the people say radical. I suppose they are, really. They're not necessarily particularly new, but they seem to be slipping back on the agenda. Some of the ideas that are coming from within your own party and sympathises with it, and sympathises with your general attitude to education. There, of course, there are different sorts of ideas. Let me start with what I might call, and in no pejorative sense, consumerism. The idea that parents ought to be able to treat education as a commodity that they can consume to suit themselves. And let me start with education vouchers. Now, are education vouchers back on the agenda for serious consideration?
First of all, about education vouchers, I was keen on them as an idea. And I persuaded myself it wasn't a question of civil servants persuading me. Civil servants went over the implications with me. I persuaded myself, as is their duty for any government, as you well know. No pejorative comments on them.
No. But civil servants are always in favour of keeping things as they are, aren't they?
No, I haven't found that.
All right. However, you've made your own mind
in any
up on
department I've been in. Now, I convinced myself that it isn't possible, or at least it isn't practical, to shift from where we are to a voucher system because we're not proposing to provide a market. After all, we're proposing to continue with the practice of requiring by law that every child should be educated. And we're proposing to continue with the practice that schools should be available free at point of use. Now, these are two distortions from a market that will make it extremely complicated to satisfy the requirements of those two conditions in a voucher regime. And I must emphasize that one of the things that was said before this discussion of ours in your preliminary program is inaccurate. It is not necessarily true that a voucher, if brought in, could give admission to independent schools as well as to state schools.
No, I don't.
One could limit it just to state schools.
Oh, sure.
And that was a possibility that was considered.
Sure.
But at the moment, until someone comes along and convinces my colleagues and me that despite these difficulties, vouchers could be introduced with benefit, I think they remain off the agenda. But maybe somebody is clever enough to find a way around that which baffled me.
But you don't think it's very likely, do you?
I think there are real difficulties in moving to vouchers.
Let's leave vouchers.
I would like to, but I think there are difficulties.
Okay. Let's switch to something else, which is a somewhat similar idea, except this time, instead of giving the parent a voucher, you, in fact, give money to the school. I say you, I mean the government and local education authority, gives money to the school depending upon the number of pupils that it can attract to itself in a freer market than we have at the moment. Now, is this idea on the agenda?
I think I must answer you a little more generally. Any idea with which the government plays as a preliminary to adopting it must, in my view, be based mainly upon raising standards in state schools. That must be central. We must raise standards for children of all abilities in all state schools, secondary schools, primary schools, and special schools. Now, as an add-on to that, to give more parents more choice, it is possible to consider returning in part to direct grant schools. It's possible. And I myself have said many times that the government bitterly regrets the abolition by Shirley Williams and the then Labour government of the direct grant system. And I have announced that the government is considering whether a modest reintroduction on an experimental basis of some direct grant schools might be a good idea. Now, I have to correct one other thing you've said. They would be government financed. They would not necessarily be managed by the Department of Education.
No. Those are Crown schools. We're talking about something different here.
No, we're talking about Crown or direct grant schools. They bear the same shape. And they would be financed by the taxpayer, but they would be managed not by the government directly, but by some other body or bodies.
Yeah, well, I'll come back to that because I want to ask you about Crown schools, which I at least regard as something different. But when we talk about this particular thing, which is coming back to something nearer to the old direct grant thing, I take it that your answer here is that though it is not certain it will happen, this is not off the agenda.
No.
It may not prove to be impractical and it might be done.
That's right, but on a modest and experimental scale, and not to take away from the centrality of raising standards in the huge state system.
Of course. Now, let me come to Crown schools. We needn't quarrel about terminology, but I take these to be something different. I take these to be schools that are perhaps set up in inner cities, we can check on this, which in fact are funded quite directly by the Department of Education and Science. Maybe not managed directly, but funded directly.
As with the direct grant list.
Sure. Now, are you in other words, your answer to this is the same as to the other, and you take them to be the same thing?
The same family.
All right. Now, can I ask you, are they going to be confined to inner cities?
No.
All over the place?
If there were a reintroduction on a modest and experimental scale of some centrally financed, though managed not from the centre, schools, some of them might be, some of them would not be. After all, the problem is not limited to inner cities, so the problem is at its worst there. There is a lack of stretching of children in schools in the country as well as in towns, in general in this country.
Sure. Can I ask you, will they be selective? Will there be selection for them?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Shall I say that
But
again?
you don't rule it
Not.
out.
The old direct grant family was a selective system,
Yes.
a very small system compared with the huge state system. The very name carries an implication of selection. But certainly, I don't foresee that any experiment we introduced would have to be selective. Indeed not. We haven't got
But you
far
don't
enough.
foresee that it wouldn't necessarily have not
But
to
you
be selective.
speak as if there was a cut and dried plan
No,
on
no.
which
No.
I was being...
It's your ideas I want.
The idea, then, is that Crown School, direct ground school, not necessarily selective.
If it were selective, if after thinking about it you decided that a bit of selection would be a thoroughly good idea, which way would it be done? Because, let's be frank, I suspect people's political response varies enormously to this. If you say it's going to be done on the basis of putting able people in it, it will be politically red hot because a lot of people, including most of the teachers, don't believe in doing that for good reasons of their own. If, on the other hand, you say, on the contrary, it will select the most disadvantaged children we can find, then it won't be politically red hot because that's regarded as positive discrimination, and these days practically everybody seems to be in favour of it. So if you did select, which way would you tend to go?
I don't see these as the options. One of the unavoidable ways in which selection is present in any choice, in any option, is that those parents that are most concerned for their children, thank the Lord, a large majority, may I say, will tend to take advantage of any choice that they think advantageous for their child. Now, selection to that extent may be, to some extent, unavoidable if we make it possible for a school to open up, be it in town or country, that is not managed by the local education authority. Some parents will see that as a good thing. And in that case, they will opt for their child to go there if they can. Now, there will be a limit to the numbers.
And are they going to have, exactly, you see, I mean, how many parents are going to have this chance to opt for this smashing school that you're going to set up?
It won't necessarily be a smashing school. It won't necessarily be, because one of the purposes of all this, of course, is to galvanize and stimulate the standards in the state school.
Sure.
And therefore, the parent will have to make a judgment. Now, we're jumping far ahead of where the government is at the moment.
All right, then I'll jump no further ahead because
Good.
too many hypotheticals create problems. Let me switch to something quite different, and that's your number two, the very able man, Chris Patten, who seems to be arguing for something quite different from consumerism. He seems to be arguing for what, and I don't think you disagree with me here, Sir Keith, the civil service, who we were mentioning earlier, have always believed in, namely that, on the whole, Whitehall knows best. And that if the education system doesn't liven its ideas up very soon, the government may well find it necessary to exercise even stronger guidance over the LEAs and the schools themselves, and they may, for instance, start earmarking more funds and laying the law down generally. Now, is this what he does mean? And if he does, do you agree with him?
You are in the game of either or, aren't you? The fact is that one could have both.
How could you
One
have
could
both?
have both. Because conceive it to be possible that, as Chris Patten said in that excellent speech of his, the government considers that it now gives to the Department of Education very, very much less financial influence than the holders of my office had immediately after 1944. And that is the fact. In 1944 and for succeeding years, the government had an education grant that gave them much more influence over local authority decisions in education than we have now. So it will be perfectly possible to increase that financial influence, a fraction or a substantial amount. There would no doubt be arguments, but it is possible. And it would be possible at the same time to have some experiments, some modest experiments, with a small fraction of direct grant or crown schools as well. So it isn't either or. The question is whether either of those steps should be taken in addition to the central problem, the central policy of raising standards in all state schools.
And what do you think? Should it?
I think that we should consider increasing the financial influence of central government. After all, central government gets the blame, as you're constantly telling me, for all educational performance, and yet we have very, very, very few instruments to affect what is done.
But, Sir Keith, one in life in general, not always, of course, because it's a wicked old world, but in life one gets the blame for what one accepts responsibilities for. And I put it to you that it is philosophically quite different for the government to say, look, you ought to run your own lives much more. We're going to give you the chance to do it. We're going to give you a lot more choice. And don't come running to the government about a lot of these educational problems. Work them out yourselves with the teachers. Or to say, ah, yes, well, of course, what is obviously needed here is the guiding hand of Whitehall to tell people locally what is best for them. Now, you can't really, it's all right to say you can try a bit of both, but you'll have to send a pretty clear signal which one of the two you fancy. You can't really have it both ways.
Oh, but one can, indeed, because...
Do you think this is going to muddle people slightly?
Even in the fiercest of market functions, the Tory party believes that there should be a framework of law, a framework of competition, and a framework, for instance, of food and drug laws. So with education, the government is perfectly entitled to say to people, we propose to give parents a little more influence, to give them some more choices, but we shall still lay down standards. We have Her Majesty's Inspectors of Education to report on standards. We're not going to allow, so far as it is possible, really bad education. Now, if you tell me we're not totally succeeding, I will readily confess it. After all, large number of children go truant. We're not always successful in getting them into school.
All right, let
alone in the standards in school.
Since I think you are in danger of being a bit of a politician yourself on this one and trying to have it both ways, let me switch you to something different.
No, I think that's unfair. I think framework is part of the philosophy to which I adhere, and I suspect it's part of the philosophy to which we all adhere.
All right, let me switch to something different. Obviously, education is coming forwards, and you would say it should, I suppose.
Absolutely.
In terms of people's significance.
Absolutely.
Its political identification is becoming stronger.
About time.
All right, then. Is it, therefore, in the future, let's not talk about the present situation. Is it in the future going to get more resources, either because you think it ought to for its intrinsic merits, or because it's becoming politically vital to give it more resources if you want to win the next election?
I think that my colleagues, and I can't speak for them, but I think that they will say that only if we can be sure that extra money provided is used effectively, should the taxpayer be asked to pay more. Now that harks back to the subject we were just discussing about whether the government should have a shade more influence. Now let me give you a particular example. We have introduced, and David Young, my colleague David Young, was very instrumental in this, a technical and vocational ingredient in the curriculum on a pilot basis. Most of us think that we should expand that, make it more universal. That would mean more money. And I hope that there will be more money for it, though no decision has yet been made.
All right, let me ask you a last question, Sir Keith. What would you say to a viewer who had watched this program and who said, well, Sir Keith is obviously a very intelligent man and well-intentioned, but he admits himself that he sometimes alienates people. I greatly admire a lot of the things that he's done, but I do not think we shall ever have a proper relationship with teachers and get things moving so long as he's there. Now, let me put it like this. If you thought that was so, and you thought your reforms could only be brought to fruition by you yourself going, are you prepared to consider giving someone else a fresh start at the Department of Education and Science?
Such decisions don't depend upon me only, as you well know. I have announced that I'm not going to offer myself for the next election. It's up to the Prime Minister, as you well know, when she changes me.
All right. Sir Keith, thank you very much indeed.
Still on the political scene, agenda in a moment.
See the world in one country. New Zealand. 3-week inclusive holidays start from £999. Call 01200 0200 for details.
It's odd, isn't it, that when things are first invented, someone invariably comes along later and invents the same thing all over again, only smaller and better. Well, now it's happening to the mortgage process. A new lender called the Mortgage Corporation have managed to avoid many of the traditional hassles which may arise. And instead, they've come up with what they believe is a really quick and easy way of getting a mortgage. You don't have to save with the Mortgage Corporation, or indeed have any kind of account with them. And since all they do here is mortgages, it's not surprising they're rather good at it. But one thing about the Mortgage Corporation that isn't small is the Mortgage Corporation itself. It has the backing of one of the world's largest international investment banks. So the people at the Mortgage Corporation are sure that this is a better way to buy your home. For a brochure, you can call 0800 400 424 or look in your daily paper. Well, it's called progress, isn't it?
What does it take to get Britain started in the morning? It takes energy. British Gas. Energy is our business.
One thing you'll notice when you visit Pronto Print for your business printing is the feeling that we're working exclusively for you. As if we have a greater understanding of your particular print requirements, whatever line of business you might be in. Doing as quick and efficient a job as you'd expect of anyone working in your own company. Pronto Print. All your printing. Tailor-made.
If you want legal advice in Hampshire, you're spoiled for choice. There are 700 solicitors in the county, all qualified and independent of any vested interest. They're also very approachable, because solicitors are on your side.
Now, Agenda. And this programme contains an interview with Geoffrey Howe, which was recorded early this weekend.
This week's agenda includes Sir Geoffrey Howe on the current state of the government and the Conservative Party, Sunday trading, the latest on a major backbench revolt, and out on the district election campaign trail, the party machines get into gear.
Hello and welcome to Agenda. As we were saying, these are not the best of times for Mrs. Thatcher's government. Scarcely has the dust settled on the affair Westland with its dramatic highlight of Michael Heseltine's resignation from the government, and the government faces further confrontation with a substantial number of Tory MPs by imposing a 3-line whip on tomorrow's Sunday trading vote. And that at a time when the Conservatives are still saying that it could have been worse at Fulham. One cabinet minister, who by the nature of his job is perhaps able to take a slightly more detached view of these events, ought to be the Right Honourable Sir Geoffrey Howe, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. A busy man in his own right. Back from his tour of the Indian subcontinent last week, he walked straight into a storm of House of Commons questions on South Africa and Nicaragua. Later this month, he will